Well, hello, it's me, Mark the Rector. I know you haven't seen a lot of me on these daily thoughts, and I'm delighted for the reason behind that, which is that every time I think about doing a daily thought, I look on the list of those that are coming up, and there's no spaces left. So it's just fantastic to have such a great team. And I do hope that you're finding these daily thoughts helpful and useful. Now, something else I do daily is a morning prayer. And I know that a number of people do find that useful because they send me emails and tell me. And it's a great way to start the day, you know. Start the day with God. 8 o'clock in the morning. We just spend about half an hour together, we pray together, and we read the Bible together. Now, as we've been reading the Bible in recent weeks at morning prayer, we follow every day the lectionary, that is the church's set readings for the day. We've just been reading through the book of Exodus, and then parts of Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, and now we have just kicked into the book of Judges. Now, I'm sure you know what all those books are about, but just let me give you a quick overview. The book of Exodus, God's people leave Egypt by God's grace, and they travel out into the wilderness. They travel across the wilderness for 40 years, during which time they get the Ten Commandments. And then 40 years later, they arrive at the Promised Land. And they cross the River Jordan into the Promised Land. And then God goes before them in battle to take the land back, which was promised to them way back. It's not a new thing. God didn't just suddenly decide, I'll give this land to my people. He promised it to Abraham ages beforehand. So they're going to possess the land that God had already promised to give them. And they win great battles, and God is clearly fighting for them. And by the grace of God, they end up with a land which is their own possession in which to live. When we get to the book of Judges, things aren't going quite so well. It starts off okay. But then in chapter 2 of the book of Judges, we read these words. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. Now, you may be surprised to know that Joshua is the only man in the Bible that didn't have any parents. We know this because he was Joshua, the son of Nun. That is a joke, by the way. Of course he had parents like everybody else. But it's quite funny, isn't it? Joshua, the son of Nun. It's a good way to remember his parents' name. Well, he was 110 years old when he died. And then we read this, they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance, Timnath Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. Very precise geographical locations, which ground this book in reality and truth. Then we go on to read this. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. That is a euphemism for they too died. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. So the generation that had gone in and taken the land died, and their children, we're told, did not know the Lord. How can that be? God had done the most amazing things. He brought them out of slavery in an amazing way. He'd led them through the wilderness. He'd given them food. We're told their clothes didn't wear out and their shoes didn't wear out. God had provided for them. He brought them after 40 years to the promised land, and he'd led them across the Jordan. And he'd gone before them in battle. Great victories against all the odds had been won. God had done fantastic things. And just so the people didn't forget that, you may know that along the way, God had caused or asked Joshua to build monuments. There was one particularly by the River Jordan, where they crossed the Jordan. God had said to Joshua, build a monument there so that people will remember what I did. And now we have a generation, one generation later, and we read they don't know the Lord. They didn't follow the Lord. Do you know, there can be only one explanation, and it's this. They didn't know the Lord because their parents didn't tell them. Or at least, if their parents did tell them, they didn't tell them in a way that was terribly convincing or sounded terribly real. Maybe they didn't live in such a way as it showed what it was really like to know God and to follow the Lord. And the children drifted off. It's not something that happens deliberately. The children wouldn't say, well, now we're going to turn our backs on the Lord forever. It's a drift. We don't really want to be bothered with him anymore. As you read through the book of Judges, as we will be doing, I think, through our morning prayer services, you see that things didn't go well for this generation. God never forgot them, but God had to keep stepping in to save them and to rescue them. But they never stuck with him. Now here's the hard bit. As I look around at the church today, in our nation it is declining at a startling rate. Be aware, the church is not declining internationally. On a world scene, it's growing faster than ever. But in this country, it's declining as generation after generation don't want to know God. Why is that? Can I suggest that it may be that many of us have failed to tell our children about God? That we've failed to live in a way that demonstrates what it means to know and to love and to serve God through Jesus Christ? We haven't demonstrated godly priorities or godly attitudes. If you think you've been like that, well, all is not lost. Come before the Lord and confess to him. You will be forgiven. And pray daily for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It may be that you have got children at home. Can I encourage you, please, to tell them about Jesus? Just in a way that is natural and real. Bring Jesus into everyday conversation. Show that your attitudes and your priorities focus around God and what it means to know him through Jesus Christ. And do pray if your children have now left home, as indeed ours have. Do pray for your grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It's often been said, that the church is only one generation away from extinction. In this country, I don't think ever before has that been more true. Please pray for our young people, that God will raise up a generation of soldiers and servants that will follow him and bring Christ back to this nation. Thank you for listening, and maybe I will see you in the morning at 8 o'clock.